Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the School of Public Policy on a cold, crisp fall morning in Calgary. And welcome as well to those of us joining online. My name is Jackie Siepert. I am a professor in the Faculty of Social Work, a former dean there, but currently have the privilege and the honor of being the interim director of the School of Public Policy here at the University of Calgary. I would like to start today's event by acknowledging that we are gathered here physically on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which is comprised of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations. It also includes the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Region 3 of the Métis Nation of Alberta. So these are very special lands that have been gathering places for many, many generations. The School of Public Policy is Canada's leading policy school. We produce evidence-based research on a variety of policy issues, from homelessness to a corridor in Canada's north, from immigration to health funding, and of course here in Alberta, and particularly in Calgary perhaps, energy transition is a very important topic for us. It's one that here at the School of Public Policy we spend a lot of time thinking about, talking about, and working on. We are very pleased this morning to be partnering with the Institute for Research on Public Policy for this event. This is part of their 50th anniversary series on what should be on Canada's policy radar. Clearly, the topic of energy transition needs to be on that radar. There's a need in this country to recognize the challenge of energy transition and to consider how we navigate that volatility, that fundamental shift in our society that arises from this transition. The work taking place here at the school will support policymakers as they grapple with this issue so that the ideas, the practices that evolve from these conversations really help set the future for our country and indeed the entire planet. The school also plays a role in training future leaders and policymakers to think about issues such as energy transition, along with the other key policy issues that we have in this country. So I'm particularly happy this morning to let you know that today we have a number of our students here, students from our Masters in Sustainable Energy Development program, as well as students from our Masters of Public Policy program. If you get a chance today, those of you here in person, take a few minutes and chat with them about what they are learning and thinking about on this topic. And I would say that having seen some of the students this year over the last couple of months, I know that they have brilliant minds. They join the other brilliant minds in this room, and the conversations will be rich. So I wish you a vibrant and exciting conversation today. Thank you again to the Institute for Research on Public Policy for being such a good partner, and have a wonderful day.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Ditchburn. I'm the President and CEO of the Institute for Research on Public Policy. Thank you, Jackie, for the words of introduction, and also thank you to the school here at the University of Calgary. It's really great to be here. It's early in the morning, but I'd love to see people in person. This is actually the last of 9 events that we've co-hosted since March at Schools of Public Policy and Public Administration. The last 5 events, I just want to also thank our presenting sponsor, Vancity, that supported the last 5 events that we've held this fall. And we asked each of the schools to come up with a topic that they thought should be on, as Jackie mentioned, on the radar of decision makers in Canada. And it was the students and the faculty together here at the University of Calgary that helped choose the topic and the panelists that they wanted to hear from. And what's really hit home for me now that I'm at the end of 9 events across the country is how much they all intersect with each other. And the topic of energy transitions, for example, could be discussed in the context of nearly all the other topics that we've discussed at these various events: housing, regulatory governance, indigenous governance, political polarization, and climate resilience. Working in a think tank or at a research institute, a university, or any other group that deals in evidence-based research these days means looking at public policy challenges in a much broader way than before, and considering how different social and economic and environmental systems interact. In the case of energy transition, we're never just talking about the science, we're also talking about people and their communities and how they'll be supported during these volatile times. So I want to introduce today's moderator, Sarah Hastings-Simon. Sarah is one of those people who knows very well the intersection of all these topics, as her career seems to intersect in all kinds of fabulous ways. She's an expert in energy, innovation, and climate policy. She is the director of the Sustainable Energy Development Graduate Program at the University of Calgary's Policy School and a professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy. Sarah, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks everyone for being here in person and online. As Jennifer and Jackie said so well, I think we have quite a challenge in front of us, and it's a challenge that's really cuts across the technology, but also the people and policymakers, and policy is a key component of guiding us successfully through that transition. And so I'm really excited today to be moderating this panel with this excellent group of speakers who are going to be able to speak from really different perspectives about the different communities and cultures that will be impacted by the transition and the kinds of supports that they need. So I'll go ahead and introduce them, and then we'll get started. There'll be a chance, I have some questions for them, but then after a little while, there'll be a chance for those of you online to ask questions, as well as those of you in the room too. So do get your question wheels spinning as we're starting to talk. So first, I'd like to introduce Dore Venno. She's the Executive Director of Lynx Harvest Sky Services and Support Society in Hanna, Alberta. She's born and raised in Hanna, and as Executive Director since 2011, she plays a regional convening role in citizen engagement, organizational development, and community capacity building. Next to Dore, we have Marla Ornstein, the Director of the Natural Resources Centre of the Canada West Foundation. And as director of the center, she champions the responsible development of the West's natural resources for the benefits of all. Much of her work focuses on Canada's energy future and how Canada's businesses can prosper as the world transitions to cleaner forms of energy. And last but not least, at the far end here, we have Maggie Hanna, who's president of Innovation and Technology Scout and a member of Energy Futures Lab. She has a BSc in geology and has worked as a resource explorationist in mining, oil, and gas, and then later worked as an innovation and technology scout for the oil sands. She's now a vice president of innovation and technology for 2 clean tech startups and a presenter on energy innovation topics. So I'm going to start with a question to all of our panelists that really lays the groundwork for this conversation, which is really if they can describe to us what kind of change and volatility will look like in the different groups that you sort of speak for and represent, and what are challenges that need to be addressed that we can kind of get into as we move forward. So maybe I'll just kind of go down the line and start with you, Dore.
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. Just share a little bit of gratitude for being here today. This opportunity to have more conversations, open the door for more conversations. So thank you very much to organizers. Today, my lens I'll share with you is from a rural, small community. We started our journey in 2015 with the announcement of the climate leadership change. Our coal mine and power plant, we had the potential of losing 200 full-time, high-paying positions. The business decision was to convert fully to natural gas and the elimination of coal-fired energy. that just business decision was in effect for 2021. Policy was that that would be 2030. We were a lot quicker. We were a lot quicker. So our community definitely has rode the roller coaster of emotions and economic transition. We've had the opportunity to sit at tables with policymakers. I just keep swinging back and forth. I turn my head too much, sorry for the mic. And one piece that we found really was missing was social services. There was the initial policies to support coal-affected workers. However, the piece to support them, not just with their finances and the potential to retrain, assisting with job placements, but really was their family, their social services. So we have, as a community, had these conversations, and we really have come together through many different conversations of how we become even more resilient rural community. We have had the opportunity to work on a social resiliency audit, and that piece of work is available for anybody to review on our website. We did see some deficits in provincial federal policy initially, as it was supporting the coal-affected workers with bridge to retirement, bridge to reemployment, and tuition vouchers. So thankfully, we did have access to having one of those programs changed, the tuition voucher specifically. Initially, when that program was rolled out, only individuals that had been officially laid off had access to those dollars, which was not proactive. There was so many individuals that could, do the education training while they were still employed. So that was changed, and we are really grateful. We did ask that partners would have availability to those tuition dollars. That has not yet been changed. Just a note of the equality of opportunity we're still working on.
Thank you. I think that message of going beyond sort of the immediate needs and the pieces that are obvious and thinking about how transition affects people in their families and communities beyond that is one that's really important.
The importance of all systems working together, economy, environmental, social, those systems need to work together long term.
Great, thank you. Marla, I'll move to you. What, within the communities and with the groups that you're working with, what does that change in volatility look like, and how do you describe the challenge ahead?
Oh, it's really interesting, and I think about the word volatility that you raised, Sarah, which is a really good one to describe it. So I work for the Canada West Foundation. We're an independent, nonpartisan public policy think tank. So much like yourselves, we are policy wonks, and that's the world that I live in most of the time. And I'm going to steal in advance a phrase from Maggie saying this is going to be a very messy decade from a technology point of view, but also from a policy point of view. We have policy that's been established at the federal level, at the provincial levels, to drive us towards decarbonization and the energy transition, but it's not always a clear path because there's a lot of competing values that come up in this. Decarbonization is one that we know that we need. We have to go there, we have to be committed, and we have to go fast. But at the same time, there's a lot of other things that we can't afford to take our foot off the gas with respect to. We've seen over the last few months, or the last 6 months or so, a real focus on people realizing what global energy security means, what domestic energy security means, what actually happens when you get a rise in, or problems with energy affordability like they're having in Europe now. Those are some of the other things that are locked into the policies around decarbonization. There's also ones that I often fret over, given my own background, is integrity of land, water, food production, et cetera. Again, these are ones that we can't afford to compromise while at the same time we're still driving towards that decarbonization conversation. We need to figure out a way to make all these things happen at the same time. there's also the messy questions of you can set policy, but you have to have technology available that will get you there. The technology has to be affordable. You have to have a policy context that will allow you to implement that technology. All these bits and pieces have to come together, and I'm sure we'll return to more, so I won't take out some of my favorite hobby horses just yet. But that's where I see a lot of the volatility. The risk, if we get it wrong, is some of the pushback we have seen in other countries, which is you get it wrong enough, people get really angry at what they see being taken away from them, and then you have a change in power as people vote that government out, and what's in instead maybe isn't working in that direction whatsoever. So you have to go as far as you can while running the risk of possibly having it all move in the other direction at the end. That's some of the messiness and the volatility that I see coming down the line that we have to manage from a policy perspective.
Great. Well, there's a lot in there. I'm sure we'll get a chance to dig into some of it, that energy security one. And I think I will steal something that I heard from someone else, which I really have come to appreciate, this idea that energy security is not inherent in the fuel itself, but it's in the systems that we've built around, right? The global systems of trade and agreements between countries that provide that security, and that, you know, that can come under threat, but that also we can find ways to build it around various types of resources, but it takes work, right? It doesn't naturally arise just from the nature of a resource itself. Great. Maggie, from your perspective, what does this change in volatility look like, and what are those challenges, you know, within the entrepreneurship space and within the clean tech space that we really should be thinking about moving forwards?
That's such a good question. Canada has an emissions reduction targets now, and they're good. But what we don't have yet are the techno-economic policies that are going to help us to actually make those emission targets possible, actually make them happen. And I think this is the next step for Canada. And without that, without bringing together government and innovators and businesses and industry and society sectors, without that integration, this is going to be a rough go. And I think that, as you know, I think this next decade, maybe 15 years, is going to be messy. Because what we're trying to do here is replace hydrocarbons, which are like a silver bullet. You know, hydrocarbons are energy dense, they store well, they transport well, they're affordable, and we're trying to replace those to some extent, to a large extent, with silver buckshot. And these systems need to be integrated with each other so that we have backup plan A, B, C, and D for energy supply. Because energy security, as you were saying, Sarah, energy security trumps climate change action every time. And so we need to maintain energy on demand and not devolve into energy only as available. And the challenges with this right now for the innovation community is that the US has put in place the Inflation Reduction Act, and they are putting money a lot of places in the innovation community. And we don't have that here in Canada to the same degree. And so we're at risk of our innovation and our innovators, even more than they already do, move to the US to actually build out their innovations and to commercialize. So that's a real challenge for us right now. And it's the other thing is all of the pieces that we have in place to support innovators, almost all of them are matching funds. And matching funds are difficult to come by if you're an early stage technology readiness level 3 to 6, if that makes any sense to you. There's like 9 is commercialization, and 1 is you got a good idea, right? So from 3 to 6, it's really hard to get the funds to match to actually move your technology forward. The states have solved that. We have not.
That's one of my favorite soapboxes to stand on, to talk about the difference between Canada and the US with the SBAR funding and others in Canada, and that reluctance, I think, sometimes, in the US, and the reluctance in Canada to have governments really, go forward and make those bets on technologies that we see happening down in the States. So before we open it up to questions, I'd just like to kind of come back to each of you and have you at least give us a little taste of sort of what are those answers and what are the supports that's needed. I think some of them came out and across all the discussion around this idea of how we manage this, messiness from different perspectives. But maybe Maggie, I'll start back with you. You started, I think, to talk a little bit about that direct support. What are some of the other things that you think that policymakers should be aware of as they're planning for, really keeping that innovation here in Canada, supporting it and nurturing it at home?
Mm-hmm. Well, as usual, policy is a lot about who pays for what and when. And so we have to start making bets, technology bets. And we have to, not that we don't support the things we're not putting bets on, but we put major support towards the things that we think we're going to need. And things that, if they're successful, will have a higher level of effect. So there's like these different levels. A technology, if it's successful, might be just continuous improvement. And it might be step change. It might be game-changing, and it might be world-changing. We have a lot of game-changing and world-changing technologies here in Calgary that are moving along with, that are going to change the world, I would say. And they require support in terms of reliable policy so that investors have a way to have some comfort that we're not going to just change the government and now, carbon tax is going away. And we require a stable policy environment that is moving forward, that is set for the future, that this is what it is, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to support these guys who have game-changing technologies. These are how we're going to support these guys who have technologies that are, step change or whatever. And that has to be done in a transparent way. So.
Right, thank you. Yeah, that policy certainty, I think, Marla, that comes back to your point around, how do you move the country and the people and the companies along in a way that doesn't lead to whiplash? What are some of the elements that you see as key to make that happen?
I think what Maggie just said about stable policy environment is really key. In order to make investments in decarbonization technologies, companies and industries need the certainty that the policy is going to be around for a while. You don't put something in because you assume there's a $170 carbon tax and then it's gone the next day, and how do you explain that? So we need that, but we also need, I think, transparent and understandable policies within each one, but also in terms of how they interact. I know this stuff is complicated, but sometimes it's almost impenetrable. I spent about 1.5 years trying to figure out the clean fuel standard, and I still don't have my head wrapped entirely around the nuances of this. The intention of something like the clean fuel standard is to drive certain types of behavior. But if it becomes so difficult to understand how exactly it's going to work and how it's going to interact with other things like the output-based pricing system or the tier program or all kinds of other things that we have, then it's not going to change that behavior. So I think, again, we need transparent, understandable policy that is clear in terms of how it interacts with everything else, as well as being stable. That to me is a big issue.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I think it's Really, as you say, the Clean Fuels Standard is one that is, I think, the best example of some of the challenges that come about in policy design and balancing that, you know, simplicity with trying to do everything and make that understandable. So I want to come back to you before we open it up to questions, because we heard, I think, a lot across the panelists around this idea of messiness and volatility and the fact that, you know, there is a need to make this change, and that's sort of, you know, it's not an option. It's because of the, you know, the need to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, but also, frankly, because, you know, in Canada we live in a global world that itself is changing, right? And we also have to respond to changing demand for our products from around the world. But how does that translate back to, you know, what is, you mentioned the social services and family support, and to me, when we think about messiness, you know, that's sort of almost the first thing that policymakers are responsible for with their constituents, to take care of, you know, the people of Canada through this messy situation. So I think you gave us a couple of examples, which I find really enlightening, around thinking, you know, it's not just the individual who's losing their job, but their family as a whole. Can you say a little bit more around, you know, policymakers? I think the town of Hannah is really, you know, as you said, you've been through this. You're sort of one of the first, I would say, in Canada to have gone through this energy transition. And so I think you have a lot to share with the rest of Canada. But what are those lessons around what needs to be front and center in policymakers' minds? And maybe where are those sort of places they can get tripped up a little bit if they're not careful?
Well, and I think it's just adding on to, you know, the stable, transparent, understandable policy. Two pieces that's really important to be mindful of are people-centered policies and also rule, the effect of what that looks like, because it looks very different. The infrastructure to move forward for different technologies isn't the same as it is in large urban centers. I think that being mindful of that individual community perspective is really important, and that people-centered direction as we're moving forward with our next policies is hugely important. That continuous conversation between all of the systems working together.
Great, thanks. Well, hopefully these kinds of conversations can help that, because I do think that is often missing, right? We have a lot of conversations that take place within the technology sphere or within the business sphere, and really connecting those, I think we're starting to make more progress on, but connecting them with the communities, I think we're probably furthest behind. So, well, I'd like to give folks a chance to ask their own questions, because I think that there's a lot that we can learn here today. So I will turn it over to Clea, who's going to share with us questions that are coming online. And then, as I mentioned, in just a moment, Judy will be coming around with a microphone for those in the room who have questions as well, too.
Thanks, Sarah. Hello. Hi. So we've got some questions coming in from the Zoom, as you said, which is awesome. I'll start with one from Ross Horgan, who mentions that yesterday Greta Thunberg said that if we already have nuclear plants running, she feels it's a mistake to close them down to focus on coal in Germany. Mm-hmm. How do you view the role of nuclear energy in Canada's future, including the possible refurbishment of Pickering and small modular reactors?
I'd like to take this one. So I'm a big nuclear fan, and I never used to be. But I am now, and I have my favorite reactors. and I'm a big fan of Germany not shutting down their nuclear reactors to fire up coal plants, although coal plants are, like I say, I have COVID brain. I just want to say I stop in mid-sentence sometimes. Coal plants are great for reliable electricity that just keeps on ticking. It's affordable, but the emissions are not tolerable anymore. And so reliability trumps climate change every time, and we see that in Germany as a really good example. Pickering absolutely refurbish it, absolutely. And we need to move into more molten salt reactors. Molten salt reactors are the best thing since sliced bread, you know. They have this natural ability to self-regulate. So the nuclides that are colliding are inside molten salt. So what happens is when it starts to heat up too much, the salt expands, just naturally, by physics, just expands. And that makes those nuclides farther away from each other so they don't hit each other. You know, the neutrons don't hit the nuclides so often, and as a result, the whole thing cools down, and then the salt contracts a little bit. And now they're closer together, and it's almost like salt reactors breathe, almost. And they're so safe. There's several that also can burn nuclear waste. The Moltex, I love them. Terrestrial out of Ottawa, they're a great system. They're run about 75% thorium and 25% uranium, which is, you know, we're moving towards thorium reactors. I like the FLIBE reactor that has just been started up in China. Great, great system. So also, you know, we have an MOU here in Canada between Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and New Brunswick to test small modular reactors. And so Ontario's going to do the big one, and Alberta's going to do the medium-sized one. I think we're partnered with Terrestrial, and Saskatchewan's going to do the small one. And these are all small nuclear reactors. The definition of that is somewhere between 10 and 30 megawatts. 10 and 300 megawatts. And so we're moving forward in that way. And I'm encouraged, I have to say, on the nuclear front.
I don't know if there's other perspectives, whether that came, I'm curious actually whether, not to put you on the spot, but whether it came up in discussions in Hannah, you know, knowing that on the one hand there might be opportunities in parts of Alberta around small nuclear reactors, but of course the challenge of the timeline of readiness and sort of where your region was with transition.
There definitely has been conversation, and I don't think that conversations are over. We definitely have the space. There would need to be retooling, retraining of those individuals in industry, but I definitely don't think the door is ever closed on that conversation for potential.
Can I add to this?
Please, yeah.
I'm also very much in favor of nuclear. You know, we were talking about silver buckshot before, which means there's a lot of different solutions, and they need to be fit to purpose. And there's a lot of ways in which nuclear works. We have no clean energy. There is no such thing as clean energy, and to try to call things clean energy creates a false dichotomy. Nothing is clean. Not solar panels, not geothermal, not wind energy. It's all a series of trade-offs. With nuclear, the two big trade-offs are cost and fear. They're expensive, which is something that hopefully we'll get over as the cost curves come down. For the fear one, I have a bit of a different perspective than most people, which is people can bring up Chernobyl, and people often bring up Fukushima in Japan from 2011. So I used to live in Japan before 2011, well before 2011, and I lived at the town that was closest to the epicenter of that earthquake, a town you probably haven't heard of called Ishinomaki. And I used to ride my bicycle to teach in an elementary school, the next little tiny village over, called Onagawa. The town of Onagawa was 100% wiped out by that tsunami. Every single building was gone except for the nuclear power plant, which is where the entire town took shelter. It was built differently. It was built later than Fukushima. To me, anytime people bring up Fukushima, it's an example of, but you can build it well. It was a newer design. Fukushima was quite old, et cetera. Certainly the safety concern is huge, and we have to pay attention to it, but it's not insurmountable either. And so whenever I do think about nuclear, I think about Fukushima and Onagawa and the differences between these two. I'm strongly in favor of thorium. I'm strongly in favor of molten salt because the small land footprint, the small material costs for it or requirements for it and the consistent power with no carbon dioxide emissions is just, it's too hard to ignore now.
And I would just like to add that a nuclear power plant, small modular reactor at the high end, 300 megawatts, takes up the footprint of a football field. That's it. So it's small.
Any questions from the people in the room? So Clea, maybe you can ask a question from the people online.
Sure, we've got lots of participation online while the folks in the room get their questions ready. A few folks are asking about the connection with politics. What does a transparent energy transition policy that supports a stable policy environment look like in the current polarized political environment?
That's a big one. Who wants
That's a
to
huge
take
one.
that one? I'd love to hear the
Let's
different
talk about
perspectives.
messy.
Yeah.
I believe that we have a lot of work moving forward to bring those significantly diverse views and opinions closer together. And it is not going to happen overnight, not going to happen with one election, provincially or federally. This is a long-term process that we need to put time and energy into as we move forward with community transitions.
I'd like to add to that. There's the polarization, between parties, that's political, but then there's the polarization between the oil and gas industry and the, quote, greenies, not a derogatory term. And in the middle is the practical recognition that this energy transition cannot happen without oil and gas, because you have to build wind turbines, you have to fire up furnaces to build, to make solar panels, and that happens on hydrocarbon. And so there's just, it's like such a shoot yourself in the foot moment to be lambasting oil and gas companies for what they did, some of them did 40 years ago, versus what can happen now. And how do we, as consumers, consume less hydrocarbons and more of the rest of this silver buckshot that we need to put together. And there's a distinction that has to be made between the goal at 2050 and the pathways we need to take to get there. A pathway, you can't take a step where you're not, from where you're not. So at the beginning of the pathway, we'll be doing things that we're not going to be doing by 2050. And those things are required, necessary, and the greenie people say we can't be doing that anymore. But it's either do those things or we're not going to be feeding people.
There's when I think about what I would want to see in terms of policy to make it transparent and understandable, which is sort of how I'm hearing the question as it came in, there's two pieces of information that are very often lacking when new decarbonization policy is introduced, or they're not complete or they're not coming at the right time. One has to do with a real economic analysis of it. And again, if I think about the Clean Fuel Standard, the economic analysis, which in my mind was not a credible economic analysis, came at basically at the point at which it was introduced. It was at the tail end of the whole thing. So it's really hard to gauge the question of benefit versus cost. What's the value there? So I think we need the transparent economics. The other piece of the puzzle that we need when something's introduced is again a credible accounting of saying, what's this going to do, not coming onto a blank slate, but given all the other policies that are already in place. And that's something that's really tricky, because no new thing that's introduced is coming in to a green field, so to speak. It's landing in the context of a lot of other policy that's there already. And sometimes the assumptions I see being made are this would do this as though nothing else existed. And so is it going to make this much of a difference? Is it going to make this much of a difference given what we already have? Is it going to cost this much or is it going to cost this much? This is information that I want to know to be able to weigh the value of a particular approach. I'm not quibbling at all with the objective of where we get to. It's the question of how do we get there? Are we taking the smartest road to get to where we need to be? One that is cost effective, one that we're likely to actually get all the way down, one that doesn't take us way out of our way, et cetera. Those are two pieces of information that I definitely want to be cleared up as we continue making policy that gets us to where we're hoping to get to.
That need for information, I think, is an interesting one, and that idea of sort of where you would be headed in the absence of a policy and what does policy do. I know, Dora, you mentioned this idea that the coal phase-out policy has a deadline of 2030, but that there was this business decision made to actually repower to gas sooner than that. And to me, I'm trying to formulate it exactly the question. Maybe it's sort of, tell us more about how the community faced that. But I think one of, I'll take my moderator's prerogative and add one point here. But I think one of the challenges that we face in Canada is that we're not always being honest, within the policy discussions around what would be happening in absence of policy, right? And given all the change that is happening outside of Canada, given all the change that's happening on the technology side, I don't think that we wouldn't be continuing in this business as usual world, even if all of Canada's climate policy went away. And so given that, how do we sort of assign impacts to policy versus other things? And how does that change the conversation at a community level when there are those different forces that are driving it?
Well, interesting enough that the very liminal space that our community was in, waiting for the policy to actually come into effect, was probably the most difficult time. The not knowing was significantly more difficult than the day the last coal went across the highway to the power plant, because then folks, community, industry, knew what we were dealing with. But from 2015 to 2021, we saw significant increase in needed supports with mental health and addictions. We saw a significant increase in domestic violence cases in our region, and the privilege of knowing wasn't felt in our region. So that really difficult transitional not knowing space was actually more difficult than the day the change happened, and the single change of the elimination of coal-fired energy. When that gas conversion was official, people could then deal with it.
Interesting. Thanks for sharing that. I think we have a question in the room. So.
Yes, I've worked with hydrogen. There seems to be an awful lot of enthusiasm going towards hydrogen. However, working with it is extremely dangerous. I see nothing in the policies or comments bearing out how safe a safety issue of dealing with it. And remember back to the Hindenburg, which should be in everyone's mind. Is there any thought in the policy today with the move towards hydrogen? Because there's a lot of enthusiasm for it. Is there any thought in people's minds of the safety issues in handling hydrogen?
Well, I'm the hydrogen chick here. And I would just have to disagree with you. Because hydrogen is no more or less dangerous than natural gas as long as you know how to use it. It behaves differently. The lower explosive limit and that's the one that matters, not the upper one. The lower limit is 4%. For natural gas, it's 5%. And the Hindenburg, I mean, that, people always ask me, well, what about the Hindenburg? and the Hindenburg was a lighter than aircraft filled with hydrogen that went across the Atlantic at a time when no other plane could do that. And it was the precursor ship, the Graf Zeppelin, actually made 1 million miles of transit before the Hindenburg even came online. Hindenburg made 35 trips before it ran into a storm, and it had to stay another day in the air, and it had to go around this major thunderstorm. So when the Hindenburg dropped its line to the ground, the spark went up and lit the flammable surface of the dirigible on fire, which then lit the hydrogen on fire, and the hydrogen went straight up. So you know, I think it's the wrong question to say how many people died in the Hindenburg. It was 35, I think, out of 92. And the question is, how come so many people lived? And that's because hydrogen goes up in 1 second, 6 stories. It's so light. You blink one time, you release it, you blink, it's up 6 stories. So solution by dilution is very good with hydrogen, and so is lateral as well. You know, and I hear your point. You know, it's not something we're used to using, but we deal with flammable things all the time. We gas up your car. You have natural gas coming into your boiler in home. We deal with these things all the time, and when we get the proper systems in place, I think we'll find that hydrogen is as safe, if not safer in a lot of circumstances than natural gas. You still don't want to be releasing it indoors because it will blow up. And the hydrogen flame front is quite a bit faster than natural gas, but you don't want to be releasing natural gas inside either. So,
it's extremely difficult to contain because normal steel doesn't contain it like natural gas because of the smaller molecule. And that's where the issue comes in. And you're right, it diffuses, but if any chance that it can collect someplace, it will collect. And that's it's very difficult to contain it. Where I worked with hydrogen was trying to seal it, and what we used to seal it was used gold plating. But what was the most extreme method? Well, it's pretty expensive. You're going to gold plate pipelines, but you can allow them to fuse, I guess, but if it collects...
So I just want to interject for a second. There's a whole lot of new technologies for containing hydrogen now that include things like tanks with certain structured carbon in them so that the hydrogen can go in at a fairly low pressure and it sticks by adhesion instead of... and so you don't need as much compression. And those things work well. We have metal organic metal hydrides now that work like a hot darn in terms of safety. I'm not a big fan of liquid hydrogen, but you know, that's just me. So there's a lot of tech, like the carbon fiber tanks in a Mirai, very safe, for example. And you're right. You know, hydrogen does go through carbon steel. It doesn't go through nickel steel. So our hydrogen pipelines are made of 13.5% nickel steel. And, you know, there's ways around that are coming faster than you think, I think. Yeah.
We have lots of great questions still coming in online. What does just energy transition mean to you from the local to the global level?
Great question. I think everyone has a perspective on that one. Marla, we'll start with you in the middle.
Oh, I thought you were going to start with Doria.
Okay, we can start, yeah. We'll start with local. I feel like I picked on her last.
No, certainly. And I've had the opportunity to have many interviews with journalists, with academics, specifically on, you know, just transition. And it hasn't been a just transition, but we can learn from that. And we will move forward to share what we could have done better with whoever will listen to us, with the long-term community transition. All voices have to be at the table.
And just to kind of poke on that, so the idea of all voices at the table, I think that sounds very important. How do you create structures that enable that to happen, right?
I think in our rural regions, we're probably 3 steps ahead of most relationship building. Out of necessity for century, we've worked well with our neighbors out of necessity. So the relationship building is not new. And we can have really difficult, hard conversations because we have trust built.
Okay, that's an important lesson, I think, for those of us not in those communities, and then the investment that has to happen to build relationships, right, where we're not, I think, necessarily doing a good job having those difficult conversations in a polarized space.
Well, and so to add to that, so you don't create that we versus them and that defensiveness on behalf of the community to be talked at, told what, there needs to be that, I guess, just, in the conversation of that continuous, transparent, hard conversations. And that's the only way you're going to move forward if there is engagement from the community.
Thanks. Marla?
I think I'm just going to stay out of this one.
Okay.
Dory's got a lot of good stuff.
Well said.
Wonderful. Thanks for that question. I think that's really key to a lot of what we're talking about. And I mean, it always strikes me that we're having a lot of conversations about the need for it, but I think we're not quite there on really how to actually make that happen, right? And how policymakers can enable it.
And I just had a thought about this. We said before, this is going to be messy, and a lot of our systems have to change. And energy and climate are the 2 number 1 things that affect everything, and money's number 3. And so we have this opportunity right now to really change how we do things. And just transition is part of that. There are people, energy costs are going to go up, and there's no way around it. And people who are living closer to the line need to be able to turn on the power and cook dinner and not have that cost an arm and a leg. So policy and regs, perhaps something like every household gets X for supper hour, X power at this price, and if you go over that, then you pay more for it. So that whole demand response kind of thing that's tailored to accommodate people being able to afford to come home and cook supper on an electric stove, say.
Yeah, that need to, I think, similar to the idea of all voices at the table, there's a question inherent there of, how do we make sure that we're taking care of all people through that transition, right? And recognizing that there are different challenges that are faced, and the need to sort of, walk and chew gum at the same time, and that we have to plan for that transition, but you have to make sure that you're not leaving people behind in the short term. I think it is doable, right? I think sometimes that gets put forward as, oh, well, if this impacts energy prices, therefore, if we care about, people that might face energy insecurity, we can't move forward with it. And instead, the answer needs to be, how do we do both, right? And how do we even, I think the even harder, but even more perhaps rewarding opportunity is to, moreover use the opportunity to look at ways in which we're actually failing to take care of people in today's society, right? And that's, I think it's challenging because it adds another layer of complexity to solving the problem. But as you say, if we are going through a period of intense change, then it does open up opportunities to, address other problems. And maybe that gets a little bit to Jennifer's point at the beginning that, if you're thinking about other issues in Canada, they can be, understood or worked on through this lens of our changing energy systems as well, too. So, great, thanks. It looks like we have a question in the room.
Yeah, I just have one question. Thanks so much for the great conversation. My question relates to the policy environment in the US versus Canada. And in the US, certainly since the introduction of the IRA, you have a lot of carrots down there. And in Canada, you see, some carrots and, some sticks as well. So moving forward, if the goal is to have Canada be more competitive with the environment in the US, what do you see that mix of carrots and sticks looking like?
Question. Does anyone want to take a stab at that?
Forward on this.
Okay.
It's a great question. I don't have an easy answer on this one. Looking at, I know that they're calling it IRA to try to separate it from the Irish Revolutionary Army, IRA. They chose the acronym, so.
They did.
It's a big bill, and there's a lot that's in it. And I know that ostensibly it comes with something like a $350 billion spending tag with it. I've heard estimates of it may actually be more like $800 billion. I don't know if that's the case or not. It's big. And I've been asking people, and I'm curious to hear Sarah's opinion on this, about the extent to which it will be good for Canada versus bad for Canada. Does it compete against us and lure away innovation and drive things more to the States? Or will it have more of a trickle-down effect where it brings down some of the cost curves on things that we would want to implement here, maybe brings in Canadian companies and workforces? Maybe it's a bit of both. I don't know. We probably can't afford to get into an arms race of carrots, but at the same time, if we do nothing, we also don't want to watch innovation just drain away here. So I would toss this back to our very wise moderator, and I'm really curious what your answer is.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you said it really well in that, we can't afford as Canada an arms race with the US on innovation spending, right? We'll lose. I think it is important that we, as Maggie brought up, that we are really focusing our carrots, if you want. There is, our climate policy in Canada it looks a little bit looks quite a lot stick-like, but in the implementation of a lot of the carbon pricing and things, there's kind of a lot of carrots there. So I think one of the important responses should be to really look at that. How do we focus our innovation spending? As to whether it's, trickle down good or kind of competition bad, I think there we really, to some extent, control our own destiny, right? And so if we start to plan for the demand for goods and products and raw materials, frankly, that the U.S. is going to need to achieve all of the goals that they've set out and actually spend all that money, I think we have incredible opportunities, right? And we have, we have electric bus companies. We have, as we sometimes talk about here in Canada and in Alberta, we have a lot of natural resources, the metals and minerals that go into these products. So I think there is an opportunity there that if we go after it, we have the chance to be a provider of choice and a trusted trading partner to the U.S. on that. If on the other hand we choose to sort of ignore that change that's coming, then I think we're at threat of seeing demand for our major exports decline without a replacement. So it's really, I think, more important than ever that we plan for what it is that the rest of the world, and in particularly our closest neighbor, is really doing on the policy side.
Great question. Thank you.
I'll ask another one from online, and then we'll have one more question in the room before we wrap. This one is to Doré from Alison Mosowicz. Do you see the social resilience study or Hannah's experience being scalable for larger job loss as we move away from combustible energy sources?
Absolutely. I think that we would definitely have to look. It's maybe not all of, but there's pieces of it and the process that I think is so valuable to share with other communities. So kinda, but definitely would be really interested in having further conversation. If you want to send me an email, we can definitely talk offline about that.
The energy transition, it seems to me, requires three things all working at the same time. It requires policy, technology, and economics. If you only have two of those three, nothing happens. Or one of three, even less. Are the universities, our tertiary education systems, are they up to scratch when it comes to the energy transition, looked through that lens? And what needs to change if they're not?
Great question. I mean, I think we have some different perspectives as, you know, if you're looking for startups, are people being prepared? I know Canada West has done a lot of work on this. I know that wasn't your focus, but maybe you can share some. And then, of course, also, Dory, through the sort of retraining and especially reaching into more rural communities, is that availability there?
Yeah, firstly, I endorse your sort of three-legged stool there of the fact that you need the technology, you need the policy, you need the economics. I think we also have seen that you need the people. That's another leg that has to go there, both those who can help make it happen, but also those you don't want to leave behind. Mm-hmm. So you start adding a lot of legs to that stool pretty quickly until you get a little octopus stool going on, and they're all important in my mind. I personally can't speak to whether the universities themselves are preparing for change on all fronts, but I can also say that this is all the institutions at once. This can't be done without the rural municipalities being ready, without the government being ready, without institutions, things like Alberta Innovates or Emissions Reduction Alberta also being part of this picture. This is an all-hands-on-deck effort. I can't overstate how massive this change is going to be and the extent to which it is going to reach its little fingers into every aspect of what we're doing. The thing that makes me really enthused when I think about where we're at in the energy transition is it can feel really painful right now. What we're doing is we're looking at and saying, look at all our broken eggs, not look at this beautiful omelet that we've made at this point. We're not at the omelet stage yet. We're still throwing the eggs onto the floor. But there are worldwide and within Canada so many brilliant minds who are working on this right now that it gives me more encouragement that we're actually going to get ourselves to a good place. Maybe not the optimal place and maybe not on the easiest path, but this is not just a small number of scientists off in a corner someplace trying to figure out how we do things better. This is a society-wide values shift and a change in our institutions and technologies that are going to keep up with that. It seems to be all hands on deck right now, and that part makes me happy.
I'd like to add to that. It is, if I want to innovate a system, I start with, it's complicated, right? Complication is where you have all these pieces that are different from each other, and you don't know how they relate to each other, right? That's complicated. But when you start to work with those pieces, you start to see where the connections are. You start to see that, oh, if I change this, these three things change in that way. Now we've moved from complication to complexity. And to be able to understand the complexity of a thing means that we're set up now to do systems thinking. Now we know what it is. We know how everything connects to everything else, and now we can say, so if we want a better system by 2050, what does that look like? And then you say, how do you get there from here? What's the pathway, and how does that pathway change as you go? So it's, are the universities doing this? I can't really answer that. I can say that in my experience, a lot of the technical sides of the universities are actually putting together the complexity, and how we move into systems thinking is next, I would say.
I love, Maggie, the fact that when you talk about mapping out this complexity, you're not talking about it in a theoretical sense. I've actually seen the scroll that Maggie carries in the back of her car that she will unroll across several meters that has all this stuff diagrammed out. It's fantastic.
I call them a horse blanket.
But in relation to that systems thinking, there can't be silos within it. And sometimes that is one of the biggest challenges that we have encountered.
Really good point, yeah. No, this is a silo-free zone. Yeah.
One more question.
All right, thanks for the wonderful conversation. So energy transition is a massive change, requiring all hands on deck, the academicians, the people, the lawmakers, etc. How do we get all these people, right, to align with this energy transition? Because only then can you go far, only then can you get there, and only then can you get fast, right? What's the best approach to get all hands on deck, everybody, so that we can be able to achieve this goal?
It's long-term process to get everybody's arrows pointing in the same direction. And it's going to be hard work, and it's going to need attention for a long period of time to bring those arrows pointing the same way.
I'm going to say dump Twitter. It creates the opposite of the kinds of conversations that we need, which are face-to-face, whole-person conversations. That's it for me.
I would say that things don't actually have to be all lined up in the same direction. They have to be roughly the same direction. You know, some can be a vector this way, some can be the vectors that way, but they're all kind of going in the same direction.
Move in the same way.
Yeah, they don't have to be perfectly lined up. And I would say intention is everything. Mm. Like, you can do exactly the same thing with a different intention and you'll get a different result. So what we need, I think, is an alignment of intention first. Yeah.
Great question. I see Jennifer jumping up. Should I wrap things up, or do you want to go ahead?
You go ahead first, and
Okay.
I'll do the wrap up.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for such wonderful questions. I've been thinking about, how to bring this conversation all together, because I think we've heard so many things and so many excellent ideas. So I just wanted to pick a few that really stuck with me around the need for policy transparency and certainty, and to build that with all voices at the table. I think that the last conversation that we were having there really spoke to that, and this idea of silos. And that, when you are going to bring in the three-legged stool and add community to it, I think that's maybe the most challenging piece with our existing policy institutions, is the degree to which they are siloed, both in terms of thinking about, technology and then how that technology impacts individuals. But even when you get down into the, details of the technology itself, and you have a, say, natural gas distribution company and regulators that don't necessarily talk to the electricity side. And so how do we really, for policymakers to find ways to bridge those silos? I was also, maybe just to end on that point, we talked, I think, a lot about the challenge and the volatility. And Dory, I thought your point was really interesting, that the most challenging time was not actually when the plant had, finished the transition, but that it was in between. And so now that period of sort of the planning and the waiting and needing to rely on the ability to have those difficult conversations, not on Twitter, but face to face, and in that complexity, is really important. But I think that gives me some hope that just because, we may find it very challenging in the middle, it doesn't mean that, we won't eventually get to our omelet and to our beautiful scroll of solutions together. So thank you all so much for sharing your perspective today. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience appreciated it also.
Thank you, ladies.
I want to add my thanks. Yes, thank you. I think we should give them a round of applause. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah, Dore, Marla, Maggie. It was really a wonderful conversation. And Marla, I'm struck by what you were saying about face-to-face, whole-person conversations, because certainly I think for people here at the university and for think tanks like the Institute for Research on Public Policy, Canada West Foundation, other organizations are trying to convene people to have these types of conversations and make sure that we don't fall into silos and that we support evidence-based research. And certainly that goes to the mission at the IRPP. So I really appreciate this as a great way for us to cap off 9 events that we've had this year. So I want to thank the University of Calgary School of Public Policy for co-developing and co-hosting this event with us. It's been a delight to be here, and I'm like full of early morning energy after that conversation. I'd also like to thank Van City for its support of the 5 events that we've held this fall as a presenting sponsor. Et j'aimerais aussi remercier l'équipe de l'Institut de recherche sur la politique publique, surtout Judy Mani, Cléa Desjardins, Ricardo Montrose, and all the rest of the team at the IRPP. We are Montreal-based, in case you're wondering why I suddenly started speaking French, and we're a bilingual organization. But it's been really wonderful for us. This is our final event of the series. It's been really wonderful for us to go to all the different provinces and different schools and meet with students and hear about the topics. And I hope that we were able to pierce through to that radar of decision makers with these events. For anyone watching online, please follow the IRPP on any of our social media réseaux, including Twitter. Sorry, Marla. But we're actually very positive on Twitter if you want to find out about our future events, and we could very well be coming to your city. You never know. And everyone have a good morning, and please join us for coffee here in the room. Sorry, people online, but that's the way it goes. Take care.